prayers.
Let us pray. Guide us, Lord, in all our doings with your gracious favor. Further us to your continual help. That in all our works begun, continued, and ended in you, we may glorify your holy name. And finally, by your mercy, attain everlasting life. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, send forth, we beseech thee, upon thy servants who bear office in this country, the spirit of charity and justice, that they may in all things walk before thee with steadfast purpose and a single heart, and faithfully serve in their several offices, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Most gracious God, author of all good things, we humbly beseech thee for the Parliament of Barbados, especially the Senate at this time assembled, that thou wouldst be pleased to direct and prosper all their counsels to the advancement of thy glory, the good of thy church, and the safety, honor, and welfare of our people. All this we ask in the name of Jesus Christ, our most blessed Lord and Savior. Amen. Together we say the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. And may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all now and forever. Amen.
The Senate is in session. Got you covered.
Messages from Her Excellency the President.
I received a letter from Her Excellency the President, which reads as follows. Her Excellency the President to the Honourable the Senate. Her Excellency the President wishes to inform the Honourable the Senate that she will be absent from the country during the period 20th December 2022 to 3rd January 2023 on vacation leave. Her Excellency further wishes to inform the Honourable the Senate that, in accordance with the provisions of Section 33 of our Constitution, the Very Reverend Dr. Jeffrey Douglas Gibson will perform the functions of the Office of President for the period of Her Excellency's absence. Signed by the President, State House, dated 16th December 2022.
Announcement by Your Honor, the President.
First of all, by way of announcements, we note that we've been restored to our traditional architectural and design framework. The clearance having been given, first of all, by the Ministry of Health, and also work having been done by the Ministry of Public Works in restoring the table. This has been the configuration of the Honourable Senate for many, many, many years. I forgot how many. But it's really intended to indicate the difference primarily between the two chambers. The elected chamber, based on British parliamentary style, the two sides are divided by two sword lengths. In the early days of British parliamentary system, it was important to ensure that if any battles were to break out, no blood would be drawn. So two sword lengths apart is the traditional width of the aisle, I'm advised, in that other place. No such consideration, no swords or intention or even potential to draw blood. The idea really of the senators to review, to be more conciliatory, yes, robust discussion on policy, et cetera, but really the very layout of the chamber indicates that there's really just is an us chamber rather than an us and them or them and them in terms of the concept, the general feel of the space. So I want to thank the Clerk of Parliament and his team for coordinating the work. We must remember that the Clerk of Parliament in our system is both the Chief Technical Officer, as our principal advisor on legal and parliamentary matters, but is also the Chief Financial and Administrative Officer. So he looks after the buildings, the funding, the administration, all things to ensure that the Parliament functions smoothly in all of its manifestations. So we want to thank him and his team, and of course, the team at the Ministry of Public Works, some of whom I understand are now over at Ministry of Housing, I think it's Housing Lands and Maintenance, yes. But they know how to deconstruct and reconstruct this chamber for its various uses from time to time. So that's my first announcement. The other announcement, we have some minutes to be deferred. Minutes of our meeting of Wednesday, December 14th, 2022. Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I beg to move that the minutes under reference be deferred.
The question is that the minutes of our meeting on Wednesday, December the 14th, 2022 will be deferred. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. The minutes are so deferred. In terms of indications of absence, Senator Kevin Boyce will not be with us today. In terms, Kevin? Oh, sorry. Senator Boyce is going to be late, not absent. And Senator, most excellent Dr. Most Honourable, he's excellent too, he's an excellent doctor. His other, the Most Honourable Dr. Jerome Walker will be late. I think those are all of the announcements for this morning.
Presentation of petitions, presentation of papers.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I am commanded to lay the following documents: Hotel and Resorts Limited Annual Report, April 1, 2021 through March 31st, 2022, the Government of Barbados Mid-Year Review Report for the period April 22 to September 2022, as well as the ministerial statement laid by the Honourable Ryan Strawn, Minister in the Ministry of Finance, Economic Affairs and Investment.
Reports from select committees, questions to ministers, requests for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance, statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries, personal explanations, motions relating to the business or sins of the Senate moved by minister, introduction of bills.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to give notice of the first reading of the following bills. The Animal Health and Veterinary Public Health Bill 2022, as well as the final appropriation 2021 to 2022 bill.
The question is that the Animal Health and Veterinary Public Health Bill 2022 and the final appropriation 2021 to 2022 bill 2022 be read the first time. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
Public business, sir.
Public business is now the order of the day.
Order number 1, in the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Electric Light and Power Amendment Bill 2022.
Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I rise on this occasion to move the second reading of the Electric Light and Power Amendment Act. This bill has been on our order paper bill for some time, and so I am confident that all honourable members have had quite an extended opportunity to review the draft proposed amendments, to review the discussions that have taken place in the other place, to benefit from the explanations from the technical officials who have spoken at great length and on multiple occasions since this bill was first debated in August of this year in the other place, and they have had an opportunity for extensive consultation. And so therefore, I will not presuppose, Mr. President, that there has been inadequate time for consultation. In fact, there has been the opposite on this occasion. And so I am going to go through, Mr. President, the provisions of the bill. I am going to speak about what the bill itself was intended to do in the first instance. I am going to speak about earlier amendments made to this bill, most recently in 2019. And I will be speaking today, Mr. President, about what the amendment is intended to do as part of the philosophy of the government of Barbados. Finally, Mr. President, it is my intention to share very briefly what the government of Barbados intends to do as a policy on the question of renewable energy. So I will start, first of all, Mr. President, with the amendment itself. In 2013, what we have here is that there were amendments made to the legislation, which then outlined what needed to be a liberalization of the grid for the purpose of electricity generation and supply for Barbadians. We saw also, Mr. President, in 2013, what was an enfranchisement mechanism where Barbadians were given the opportunity to participate in the generation and the supply of electricity. Mr. President, we saw the evolution of that bill, 2013, 2019. The bill specifically makes reference to an entity which is a monopolistic entity in this instance, and has been regulated also by law by entities which are referred to in the Principal Act. The Principal Act makes reference to an entity it calls the Commission. That is, the Commission refers to an entity, the Fair Trading Commission. It speaks to, Mr. President, the Electric Light and Power Act. It speaks also to the Utilities Regulation Act, Mr. President. And so it is to be read in tandem with the Electricity Supply Act, with the Electric Light and Power Act. It is meant to also be read in tandem with the FTC Act as well as the Utilities Regulation Act. All of those things are defined in the principal legislation which we are attempting to amend today. If we are reading the legislation as a standalone piece of legislation without the companion pieces of legislation, Mr. President, perhaps there may not be full context as to what is contemplated first in the legislation in its principal form and then in the amendment as being debated here today, Mr. President. Now, when we go through the details of the amendment, Mr. President, let us start by looking first of all at what obtained in the principal legislation. Mr. President, in the principal legislation, there were measures that said the following. A license was established, a licensing regime was being established to allow for any person seeking to supply electricity to the public grid. That's important. That is also defined in the Principal Act. It is also defined in the Utilities Regulation Act. And so it goes on to say this, that you must first obtain a license from the minister. And it outlines in 2019, Mr. President, at section 5.3, what the applicants needed to be. There are three basic categories. One, the public utility. Not a public utility, the public utility. One. Two, a person proposing to operate a generation system, the installed capacity of which exceeds the amount set out in paragraph 2 of the first schedule. what is outlined in paragraph 2 of the first schedule. Schedule 2, the first schedule only has 2 paragraphs, so it's easy to be able to follow. But for ease of reference, paragraph 2 says the following: for the purpose of section 5.3, which is what I just read, the installed capacity is 1 megawatt. That is what we're referring to. That is paragraph 2. And the third category is a person or an entity seeking a storage license or a transmission or distribution license. 3 levels that are outlined here. Under the legislation as written originally in 2013 and then in 2019, they were required to publish a notice. Any of those 3 categories were required to do the following. They were required to publish a notice of their application, very specific terms outlined, in at least 2 daily newspapers, at least twice, at intervals of 2 weeks. Let me be clear. They were required to publish a note of their application in at least 2 daily newspapers, at least twice, at intervals of 2 weeks. Let me repeat for clarity, Mr. President. In 2019, the Act was amended at Section 5.3, requiring applicants who were the public utility in the first instance at Section A, proposing to operate a generation system, the installed capacity which was defined in the first schedule in paragraph 2, paragraph B, and then seeking a storage license of a transmission and distribution. There were some specific things that then happened. The original Act, Mr. President, 2013 and then 2019, needed to ensure that there were mechanisms to implement another section, Mr. President, another section of the bill. And what is that section of the bill, Mr. President? I want to pull it up because I want to make sure that I have been as clear as I can be in what is listed in the actual legislation, Mr. President. In section 5.43, it speaks to this, Mr. President, where the applicant is the public utility or proposes to operate a generation system, the installed capacity of which equals or exceeds the amount set out in paragraph 2 of the first schedule, the applicant shall follow, and I have just outlined that. And then this is the part that is important, Mr. President, because this is the part of which we speak today. An applicant to whom subsection 3 applies shall not be issued a license until A period of 3 months from the date of the first publication of the notice of his application pursuant to section 3 has expired. I've just outlined what is established in section 3. And B, this is critical. An opportunity has been given to all interested parties during the period specified in paragraph A to make representations or objections to the minister in respect of the application. So, Mr. President, what I have just outlined is the basis on which the amendment before this honourable chamber is being debated today. What was outlined in paragraph 5.4 and what was being asked in terms of the mechanism for the provision of an objection did not have a mechanism to go along with it. So let's say, Mr. President, that I want to go to my child's school and I want to raise an objection over a policy that has been implemented. And I'm making this deliberately simple, a parent and a child attempting to intervene in a challenge that they have with a policy that has been set by a school. I know, Mr. President, my first point of reference is with my child's form teacher. I know, Mr. President, that my second point of reference is with my school's year head. I know that then there is a mechanism for the deputy principal and, if need be, with the principal. I don't start with the Ministry of Education as my first point of reference. I go to the point where I have direct reference. But, Mr. President, in this instance, in the case of this particular legislation, there was no mechanism for a person to do what is outlined in the legislation. There was no mechanism, Mr. President, for how this would be done. And it is on that basis, Mr. President, that we now have what is before us as the very specific and clear parameter which proposes to delete this section of the Act and replace it with the following. An applicant to whom subsection 3 applies shall not be issued a license until an opportunity has been given to interested parties in accordance with section 5A to make representations or objections to the minister in relation to his application. It outlines what the applicant must do, Mr. President, in very clear sections. The insertion of what we are now terming section 5A after the existing section 5, Mr. President, says the following. 5A, paragraph 1. An interested party, already defined in the existing principal legislation, who desires to make a representation or an objection in relation to an application for a license by an applicant to whom section 5.3 applies shall, within 28 days of the first publication of notice of the application, inform the minister in writing of his representation or objection. 2, subsection 2. The interested party has 4 things that they must do. Shall, compulsory language, state his interest in the application. I can't decide, Mr. President, therefore, that it is on your roof. I don't like how it looks. I live in 3 parishes upwind. It ain't got nothing to do with me, but I just don't like how it looks. So I have declared myself an interested party. What is the nature of your interest? B, shall, as far as practicable, state concisely in numbered paragraphs the precise nature and ground of his representation or objection. C, shall include any supporting evidence. And D, finally, shall not make a representation or an objection in respect of anything that is not directly related to a matter set out in section 6.2b or 3. It goes on, Mr. President, to also say, where the minister, after consultation with the committee, and I will speak to the committee because the committee is established in the principal legislation at Schedule 2, which in this instance refers to the the LPAC, Electric Light and Power Act Committee, Advisory Committee, where the committee considers that there is merit in a representation or objection made by an interested party, but additional information on the representation or objection is required. The minister may, within 28 days of receipt of the representation or objection, give the interested party an opportunity to provide such information orally or in writing. Goes on to prescribe 14 days written notice that he will have an opportunity to provide additional information. It outlines the role of the committee at subsection 5 and what the recommendation of the committee must be in relation to the minister. And then it goes on to say what must happen and in what time frames, and it establishes the principles of confidentiality at section 7 and section 8. But it also preserves the principle of confidentiality also, whereby, and I use the example, Mr. President, of CAIPO. If we were to look at the way in which CAIPO is set up, while CAIPO establishes and maintains a public register, all your business is not held out a road for any and everybody to see every element of it. There are certain prescribed forms that are established that are available for public examination, and certain things are there, but there is a defined outline for the principle of confidentiality, because in business, in the real world, there still must be some notion of confidentiality. And that is prescribed and parameters outlined in the actual amendment to the legislation. But, Mr. President, there is still some work to be done, because what we have done here is to establish the mechanism that did not previously exist in section 5.4 of the legislation, the principal legislation as amended in 2019, to provide for interested parties to object. Now, why was this done? And I have had an opportunity since joining the ministry a few weeks ago to meet with all of the agencies that fall under this legislation, whether it was the Barbados Light and Power, whether it was the Fair Trading team, whether it was the Ministry of Energy team. whether it was the advisory team and the consulting team, we have had the opportunity to hear how the legislation is supposed to interact, not just with this, but the broad energy agenda of the country, which is much broader than this, Mr. President. And this amendment came about because at the time, Mr. President, that this particular subsection of the legislation was being reviewed and objections were being received, it was discovered by the technicians in the field that there was no mechanism by which they could determine what to do with the objections. And so a legal opinion was sought. The legal opinion then came back to say this was a missing section of the legislation. It did not provide for regulations of how this was being managed, and on that basis, there needed to be an amendment of the legislation to provide for this kind of consultation. Now, that's a legal opinion, Mr. President, and I don't want to camp out only at the legal opinion. I happen, Mr. President, to belong to an administration that has consulted and continues to consult and has given its commitment to continue to so do on every matter of major public interest in this country. Mr. President, on the question of renewable energy, for the last 6 months ending in October, 6 months prior to that, there were national consultations on renewable energy as it relates specifically to PV at the community level. Mr. President, when we were in 2018, making changes to the structure of government, what was necessary, what was highly desirable, what was essential, there was public consultation. When we were having the Charter of Barbados, Mr. President, there was public consultation. Now we are in the process of having a constitutional commission, Mr. President, and there is ongoing public consultation that we have committed will last a year. The principle and the philosophy of consultation with stakeholders and interested parties, Mr. President, is enshrined in the DNA of this Barbados Labour Party-led administration. This is what we do. We are not all going to agree. We're not all going to always be on the same page, but the Prime Minister has a saying, all views must contend. And so people come to the table and they share their views, right, wrong, halfway right, halfway wrong, all right, not right at all, and all views are placed on the table. And this administration, therefore, is amending legislation on matters that speak to the heart of what we are doing as a government, which is enfranchisement of people, because the licenses that Light and Power is looking for in this instance are non-exclusive, unlike what existed before, non-exclusive. But it allows new players to enter the market in addition to, not limited to, the utility, not a utility, the utility. And so they enter the market, Mr. President, and we have a consultative mechanism where Barbadians who have an interested stake as defined, when you are an interested party, that you can issue an objection. Now, Mr. President, this is, in principle, a simple legislative amendment. I don't know if there's anyone who would object to the inclusion of consultation. I don't know, Mr. President, if there's anybody who would object to the principle of the inclusion of legislation that speaks to bringing more people to the table as interested parties to be able to treat to legitimate concerns. I don't know that anybody would do that unless, for whatever reason, they're deliberately trying to obfuscate the issues on the table. I don't know that there's anyone who would do that. I don't. But I could be wrong. Mr. President, this administration came to office on a platform of enfranchisement. In the other place when this bill was introduced, Mr. President, we spoke about, the then minister, interestingly, spoke about. It's funny because people have commented on the fact that I am now speaking on matters relating to energy, and the former Minister of Energy also was the former Minister of Tourism, and so we are both now speaking on the two primary planks of economic development in the country. Mr. President, I just came from having the portfolio with responsibility for tourism. The winter season has begun. Everybody is talking now about what it looks like, people back out to work, number of planes coming in. The winter season, as everybody knows, is locked in by July. By July, August, we already know what the forward bookings look like. We already have finished negotiations with airlines. We already know what bookings are coming in. There are some senators in here who know what the villa occupancy rates are going to look like all the way through till April, May, possibly. And I expect that they're looking good. But this was the primary plank of this economy. In this incarnation, Mr. President, this administration has said that the energy agenda, in particular the renewable energy agenda, is going to be the sector of the future. And the decisions that we make now will impact what happens later. Let me attempt, Mr. President, very briefly to speak to some of what those decisions are. And I confess very readily, Mr. President, that up until 6 weeks ago, I sat on the outside of this process, and I did not have the privilege of being able to see and to hear all of the interconnected linkages that are correlated to this. And it is far more complex than I could have imagined. And I was on the outside, now I'm on the inside, and it's still complex, Mr. President. So let me attempt to try, in simple terms, to break down some of these things. It is far more complex, and even in discussions with colleagues, they say, look, this is so complicated and spans so many different agencies that I don't know how to unpack it in full, because I only see a small part. And so I have had to take the time. There's only one entity with whom I have not yet met, only one. But I have had to take the time to meet with all of them. And it is amazing to hear, both from a government perspective, a quasi-judicial entity, which is the FTC, over which we have no specific authority because it must function with a certain level of autonomy and it must not have political interference, and so the minister cannot direct except if you look in their legislation on general matters of policy, but they have to make their decisions on the basis of what is prescribed in our competition laws. So they make their decisions separately. We also have, Mr. President, the reality of a number of industry stakeholders. We have the Barbados Renewable Energy Association, the Barbados Association of Professional Engineers. We have the Barbados Manufacturers Association. And I am telling you, Mr. President, that has been the most fascinating and exciting thing intellectually to sit in a room and hear such diverse perspectives on a single matter. Because everyone has a stake in it that is at times at odds, but needs to also come together. And it is at this point, Mr. President, that I want to make reference to the Barbados National Energy Policy. Because the Barbados National Energy Policy, articulated from 2019 and expected to take us all the way up to our 2030 target, begins to contemplate what this mix must look like. Both the energy mix, because we have a conversation all of the time about solar, PV. Everyone is excited about PV. And I was quite excited to hear in one of our stakeholder groups a metric given to me that Barbados is the #2 country, not in the Caribbean, not in the hemisphere, not in the developing world, not among small island developing states. It is the #2 country in the world in terms of PV density. There is one country in the world that has a higher density of PV penetration than Barbados, and I'm told that is Australia. One country in the world. This little island has the highest penetration of PV density in the world, the second highest concentration of PV. That is no small feat. That is no small feat, Mr. President. But it comes with implications downstream. It means that the government's policy must be matched by an investment strategy. It must be met by investment in capacity and investment in storage. It must be met by an expansion of our grid capacity, the public grid. It means also that there has to be a discussion about what the energy mix must look like, and so that we're no longer having a conversation in the public space only about PV, but that the expansion of the debate includes wind and water including wave and so on, but that we also look at the diversification into different types of fuels. So we're not just producing and using fossil fuels by cleaner technology, but we're looking at biodiesels and biofuels and hydrogen and all of those things. This is a complicated mix, Mr. President, that requires all stakeholders to be at the table. Now, Mr. President, the Barbados Light and Power is like a politician. It is the entity that people love to hate, but it is the entity that people want to be able to come to solve problems at the same time. It is like a politician. You need a politician sometimes to help make laws, to develop policy. When you have a problem in your community, you come to your member of parliament, you need help, but at the same time, this is the same person that tomorrow, if they don't necessarily help you in the way that you want, even though they helped you yesterday, you are still going to be unhappy with. That's the nature of the space, is what it is. Can't fight that. But you help anyway. And so I said to the Barbados Light and Power in our meetings very recently, there has to be a role played by a range of partners. And very early in the new year, we will bring all of these diverse entities that usually sit in bilateral fora with us to the table, and everybody will have to sit around the room and we will have to agree on where we go next. Yesterday, Mr. President, I had the opportunity to lead the energy team in a discussion with an entity which is being supported by the United Nations. The United Nations has identified and pegged someone who is deemed the United Nations Special Envoy of the Secretary General on Energy. They have been and continue to work around the world with countries in the developing world that have aggressive targets for energy. The mix that I talked about, the mix of PV and so on and so forth. How do we invest? How do we attract the level of investment? And the last country that they worked on, Mr. President, was Nigeria. One of the biggest oil producers in the world, and we always hear what has happened in terms of oil and their discoveries. The investment, Mr. President, for Nigeria, it's publicly available information, so there's no reason why I can't say it here. It's available on the website. Was over $1 trillion. Over $1 trillion to enable Nigeria's transition from where they were into where they were projecting to be. And they did not have, at the time, the kind of aggressive political will to set short targets like those in 2030. Nigeria's target, I believe it was 2060. In Barbados's case, we, a small island developing state with the highest penetration of PV density, second highest penetration of PV density in the world, has set a target of 2030. And so what that means, Mr. President, is that all of those diverse views, sometimes competing interests, are going to have to find a way, and I'm committed to presiding over the process, to ensure that the mix of views, mix of perspectives, mix of investment, mix of enfranchisement is able to come and sit around the table, not dissimilar, Mr. President. I really loved your opening comments about the return of the table. I walked in today and I thought, our table is back. This is a table that I first knew in the Senate, and every Senate before 2018 knew this table. There are some of us who were in here in the Senate of 2018, and all of us remember this table. We're happy to have it back. From 1994, the President is reminding me. And so we have to be able to bring in a non-adversarial way the various stakeholders and interest groups around the table, because there is no single perspective on this matter. And we expect, Mr. President, that over the next few months, we will have an opportunity with all of the stakeholders to work through the details of what that mix looks like and where we go from here. Mr. President, in this legislation, we also have the principle of enfranchisement and inclusion. In March of this year, in the budgetary presentation, the Honourable Prime Minister spoke about ordinary Barbadians, because what I'm talking about here initially, largely, quite frankly, is about the institutional capacity. And what do I mean when I say this, Mr. President? There is nobody who is me or you, Mr. President, except maybe one or two senators who sit on the other side who may have the kind of financial wherewithal to say, I am going to invest in the kind of, I'm going to take on the kind of investment. I am going to take on the kind of investment required to do the things that I want to see happen. I sat in meetings, Mr. President, over the last few weeks with potential new projects. New projects that invest in wind in one instance that is in excess of $500 million. Not one of us as individual, ordinary Barbadians has the capacity to speak about new projects with those kinds of numbers. That's the kind of stuff we're talking about at the institutional level, at the investment grade level. The Barbados Light and Power, in looking to procure additional capacity, we're talking about numbers in excess of $800 million. These are not small numbers, Mr. President. These are not small like things, Mr. President. And so all of the things that we want to see, especially at an institutional level and at an infrastructure level, given the fact that the public utility, which is the infrastructure, the owner of the public grid, in this instance, has to invest in the expansion of the capacity, and with it, the investment must come to enable that to take place. Now, Mr. President, what is the other element of this? The other element of this is the question, Mr. President, of the average Barbadian. Therefore, at what level do we then encourage Barbadians to get involved? The HOPE project is an example of that, Mr. President, where we as a government have used low-income and middle-income housing, but in particular low-income housing, to allow Barbadians to have ownership of their own homes so that they can use the solar panels to generate resources from their roofs to be able to get the connections. I have had the opportunity, Mr. President, as well, to see and to approve, not just for ordinary Barbadians who are already looking to go on to the grid and to spend their resources to get connected, but Barbadians who are reserving their right in the future, so that I don't want to use it now, I don't have the resources to use it now, but I am reserving it later. That already is in place to allow for the enfranchisement of ordinary Barbadians, Mr. President. That's what the Barbados Labour Party government has done. Made sure that if you don't have the resources to do something now, it is reserved later. There's someone who is sitting in this place, Mr. President, who was a former Minister of Energy in a different time. They will probably speak later. I don't know. But when they presided at the time over legislation over what would have been at the time legacy assets of the country, there was a provision then for the utilization of those assets with immediate effect as seen fit, but also there was the reservation of assets for later use, for future generations. That is what we are doing here in principle with ordinary Barbadians, equally allowing them to reserve a right for future generations of their family because the right is being reserved, Mr. President. I can reserve it for me, but I can decide to pass it on to my house, to my daughter, and it becomes hers, and she has the benefit of an asset. Generational wealth, Mr. President, for ordinary Barbadians in income classes that look like you and me in this honorable chamber, Mr. President. But there is more, Mr. President. We also have to deal with the question of storage. What does storage look like, and therefore connections to the grid? I want to say in this honorable chamber, Mr. President, that I have received no end of concerns being raised over the last few weeks about installed capacity. And I understand it, Mr. President. But when the technicians explained it to me, I thought, aha, why don't you just talk to people in English that they can understand and explain it to people in terms that they can understand? And here's what they said to me, Mr. President. They said, but Lisa, Minister, in this case it was Minister, they said, think about the breaker in your house. Use the breaker as an example. They said, if you plug in every appliance in your house and all of the different things that you may want to use all at one time, and you overload the breaker, what's gonna happen? They said to me, it ain't gonna trip. They said, it gonna trip. And what you have to do is to either expand your capacity or you have to plug out some things. And that's what they explained to me in simple, non-technical terms. They said, this one is a lot more complex than that, but that's as simple as I can break it down to you. There has to be installed capacity to be able to onboard all of the individuals, all of the institutional investors onto the same breakup. And so the expansion of the grid is a critical priority. That is something that has to be done. It has to be expanded. But there has to also be a creative way to look at what new technologies and what new mechanisms need to be put in place to allow for what I referred to earlier as the energy mix. And all of those things can and must be done in the early part of the new year as we look at the energy plan, Barbados National Energy Plan, and how we are going to be expanding and implementing that for the purpose of attracting investment to allow for the kind of work that needs to be done. Now, on the question, therefore, of storage, if we cannot onboard everyone onto the grid at the same time, in the same way that we would want at all levels, at all sizes, at all levels of capacity, we have to have storage so that you're able to generate, store, and then distribute and supply a little later on. But, Mr. President, we do not live in a bubble. I say this all the time. We don't live in a different planet than everyone else. And globally, there is a shortage of storage capacity. One of the largest companies in the world that produces battery storage is citing a shortage and the global supply chain challenges with the parts to be able to create the batteries. And on that basis, Mr. President, Barbados is no different than many other countries in the world having a long wait time for the procurement of storage capacity. We're no different. So the issue of storage has to be navigated. The issue of how much storage has to be navigated. The issue of the cost of that storage has to be navigated. And principally for those who are looking to invest in that storage, the rate for that storage has to also be navigated. That is a matter that I cannot litigate here. That is a matter exclusively in the remit of the quasi-judicial body with responsibility for regulating utilities called the Fair Trading Commission. That is not a policy matter for the government of Barbados. That is a Fair Trading Commission matter. I, as the minister, do not have the authority in law or in will to instruct a quasi-judicial body called the Fair Trading Commission. That is their remit. What I do have is the capacity to say to the Fair Trading Commission, as I have, what are your needs? You have a number of heavy, big-ticket items on your table. I cannot involve myself in your deliberations or in your outcomes. But what I can do, and what I must do, is to have the benefit from you through the Office of the Chief Executive Officer, through the chairman in the estimates process, because we are now preparing to go into the new financial year in 2023-2024. You need to come and say to me, so that I in turn can say to the Ministry of Finance, we have one single officer who is responsible for electricity, for the utility, namely electricity in this instance. We need additional capacity. We need more manpower. We need more bodies, because I can pick up and do what they do. I do not have the training or the competencies to do what they do. I don't know many people who do, because it is a highly specialized field, and whether we are able to bring those persons in from Barbados or we have to find those persons internationally and bring them in, we have to be able to say to the Ministry of Finance, these are the needs that we have. This is the optimum level at which we need to be functioning. This is the amount of financing that we need to be able to bring these persons in, and this is the time frame within which we have to do it. But guess what, Mr. President? Those are things that we can do and plan into the new financial year. At least I can do into the new financial year. But they don't change the things that are currently on their agenda and are currently being worked on, because they're already there with the limited capacity that they have. And one single officer, I am told, who is the officer with responsibility for utilities, specifically electricity, because there are officers who are assigned to water, who are assigned to telecommunications, who are assigned to electricity. And they all have to handle all the range of issues that are before the FTC in all of those areas with just the limited capacity that they have. And so with all the best intentions of the world, they are constrained by human capacity. And I want to take this opportunity, Mr. President, to express my appreciation for the work being done by the officers of the Fair Trading Commission. I want to recognize them today. Because, Mr. President, it is all right for us on the outside to sit down and say, the men do this, the men do that, they ain't got, we want this, we want that. But at the end of the day, for all of us who have taken vacations this year and gone off on holidays with our family, those officers have worked without a break because of the gravity of the issues before them. And they have attempted to put all of their resources not going off at any point, Mr. President, because they know the timelines that they're working with, and they have stuck it out. I want to recognize their commitment, Mr. President, because they get hauled over the coals all the time in public by people who have gone off on vacations, who have had weekends, who have had their nights off, without knowing the sacrifices that these officers have made and the conditions that they have had to struggle with because they understand the importance of this issue to this country. Mr. President, I want to recognize them today. I want to thank them for their service to the energy sector, Mr. President. Now, I also want to take the opportunity, Mr. President, to say this. There will come a time, Mr. President, down the road where the generations that are coming behind us will see the work that has been done on our energy mix. They will see the investment in solar PV that we have already made. They will see the philosophical commitment of this administration and the legislative changes that we are putting in place. There will come a time, Mr. President, where people can use the benefits of the resources that they have available to them as a result of the connectivity onto the grid and the resources that it generates for their households to say, this is what I want to be able to do as an investment for myself. And I say this in this context, Mr. President. While this is an energy debate, and while this legislation falls rightly under a ministry called the Ministry of Energy and Business Development, I want to take a few moments, Mr. President, to outline the scope of this ministry and to connect what we are debating here today on the energy side to the business of energy, Mr. President. Mr. President, this ministry also covers commerce. It covers small business. It covers entrepreneurship. It covers consumer affairs. It covers, Mr. President, the workings of entities like KIPO and Fund Access, the Trust Loans Program, all of those things. It covers the financial literacy program, Mr. President, that was introduced under Fund Access. Because, Mr. President, there is a connection between energy and business. And I want to share this. I had the opportunity, Mr. President, to meet with the private sector stakeholders on this matter. And I challenged publicly, in the case of one entity, the Barbados Association of Professional Engineers, and I want to commend the Barbados Association of Professional Engineers too. I challenged them, as I did the Barbados Manufacturers Association. There has to come a time, Mr. President, in this country, when a country that used to be a first mover in the development of solar panels for hot water use, this country has to also then become the first mover in research and development technology to fuel its 2030 agenda. It has to become that country as well, Mr. President, that works not just with its energy sector, but with its manufacturing sector. One of the proposals that has been made, I believe it was by the Barbados Association of Professional Engineers, and they spoke about it in their recently held awards 2 Saturday nights ago. They said, one of them said to me in a bilateral conversation, they said, Barbados should be looking at working on development of prototypes. We don't have the manufacturing capacity to necessarily be able to supply the globe. But we should be looking at research and development and innovation of renewable energy resources that then make Barbados a knowledge capital of renewable energy transformation in the globe. In the same way, Mr. President, that we are the country, as I said, the second highest country with the density of PV penetration, and the same way, Mr. President, that we, people like Solar Dynamics and others, SunPower and others, then became the first mover to use solar panels for the purpose of generating hot water. We also have the capacity in this country, in our professionals, to equally become a first mover in research and development for renewable energy technology, Mr. President. And I am looking forward. They have all taken the challenge. The Manufacturers Association, the Renewable Energy Association, the Barbados Association of Professional Professional Engineers. I am incredibly honored to work with a group of professionals of that caliber who have come to the table not only with problems, but a willingness to be the purveyors of solutions. I am proud, Mr. President, to have the opportunity to work with the University of the West Indies, who has now made a commitment to working along with the industry as well. And I had an excellent meeting with the principal of the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill, and the energy agenda is one of those things that we have agreed that we need to work on. What should be the research and innovation coming out of the University of the West Indies, partnering with industry to be able to bring solutions to the table. We easy to talk about, the problem is this, the problem is that, I don't want this, I don't want that, but you ask oftentimes many of the same problem identifiers what the solution is, and they cannot tell you. The University of the West Indies, the manufacturers, the renewable energy team, and the engineers have not said only what the problems are. They are prepared to work on the solutions, and I am prepared to work with them because they have to be part of the collective solution for Barbados's 2030 agenda. Now, Mr. President, finally, I want to close on the following point related to the amendment to the legislation. The amendment itself, Mr. President, contemplates that persons who are interested in this matter and can state what their interest is can come to the table, and it outlines a mechanism. It outlines mechanism. I want to give the assurance that the legislation does not vest in a minister, the minister, this minister, the authority to make subjective choices. If you were to revert to the principal legislation, Mr. President, it outlines very specifically what the parameters are for what the minister must and can do. And I want to take just one moment to outline what those parameters are. In determining whether to issue a license to an applicant, the minister shall, not can, shall. This is a principal legislation. It says, consider the recommendation of the committee in relation to the applicant. What is the committee? Legislation defines the committee as the LPAC. The minister shall consider, take into account, where relevant, the current and projected demand for electricity. A, the generation systems that are a part of or connected to the public grid. The generation systems of licenses, and C, the renewable energy generation systems that are a part of or connected to the public grid, and of each type of renewable energy generation system classified according to the source of renewable energy utilized. It goes on to say, Mr. President, at section 3, subsection 3, the purposes of this act being, among other things, to promote the generation of electricity from sources of renewable energy and to enhance the security and reliability of the electricity supply. This is important, Mr. President, and I want to read it into the record at section 3. It says this: the minister shall not issue a license pursuant to subsection 1 unless he is 1, satisfied that the facility and location intended to be used pursuant to the license is safe and adequate for the purpose. The applicant possesses 1, B, the financial capacity to build and maintain the facility, the technical capacity, and the capacity to prevent or minimize damage to the environment. Any planning permission, this is also required. Any planning permission required from the Town and Country Planning Act, Cap 240, has been obtained. D, The issue of a license to the applicant would not result in a cumulative installed capacity of the systems of all licenses being in excess of such amount as may be prescribed by the minister by order after consultation with the chief electrical officer and the commission. It outlines, Mr. President, very clear parameters for what is described as the minister's decision. It is not what I think. It is not what the minister feels. It is what is prescribed in the section of the legislation, Mr. President, that can be found at section 6 of the principal legislation, which clearly defines the parameters for that ministerial approval. So we can't just look at the amendment on its own, Mr. President, because the amendment speaks to, on one hand, detailed parameters for objectors or interested parties, but it also prescribes very detailed parameters also for the approval of the license as legislated in the Principal Act. But, Mr. President, I think I have, and I hope I have, said enough of what is listed in the legislation to show what is intended and not what we feel, what is intended in the legislation. This has had the benefit of a legal opinion, and it is on that basis that the work of the CPC was started. It is not my layman's interpretation or anyone's layman interpretation. It is a legal opinion that was also seconded by a second legal team to be able to make recommendations on how Barbados and how this government should, one, treat to legislation which enfranchises Barbadians, treat to consultative mechanisms on issues of interest to Barbadians, and then also how to achieve its objectives as defined in the Barbados National Energy Plan of 2019-2022. And with these few words, Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill be read a second time.
Thank you very much, Senator Cummings. Speakers? No takers? Senator Valdez.
Mr. President, it seems some people were shy this morning. Thank you for recognizing me. Firstly, let me say here that I understand clearly the amendments and it applies for a process to review the objection. And I'm very pleased with the amendments, and they will have my full support. Having said that, I think there are two areas where I would like to comment that perhaps the few words. Yeah, thank you. There's two areas where I thought that the legislation perhaps could have been slightly better, but I think that the opportunity still rests with the minister responsible for this to implement in the same way through policy as opposed through the legislation. Those two areas I'd like to speak to is one, while the amendment now gives us a process which was lacking before as to how to respond to the objections, what it does not give is a time frame for the resolution and how quickly will this be resolved. We cannot, in our move towards renewable energy, be stymied by a process that does not have an end to it. So we do not want to see lots of objections and this time period going on. Let us not forget that the objection that has provoked the need for this amendment and where the legislation was seen to be lacking was actually made in September of 2021, if I am not mistaken. And now we are in days before Christmas of 2022, and we're trying to fix the process. So I do hope that in fixing the process, we also recognize that when there is an objection, we will move assiduously to complete that process and get it resolved. There's lots in the legislation that say how long you have to object, but there's nothing that says how quickly it must be resolved. The second area I would like to speak to is the confidentiality clause that's in the amendment, which I think is excellent. And I think that Transparency must also come with some responsibility for confidentiality when needed. But it seems to me that we've got to be careful here with this one because it requires everything about the application to be revealed unless the applicant asks for confidentiality, and then we'll see if that confidentiality is given. I'm not sure that we should have done it that way in this particular case, and I refer specifically to the amendments section. I think it's 63B1 or I, and 63B2. These two areas of the underlying legislation require significant financial disclosure and technical disclosure. I am concerned that to have to give that financial information and technical information up front, and for you to have to ask for confidentiality, otherwise it will be published, I think perhaps we had that the other way around. For sure, in the application, it should be there, but I think there should have instead been a minimum amount of information that was a need-to-know basis for the general public who could see it. But if you wanted to see the financial and the technical information, you should have had to ask for it as opposed to the other way around. But, Mr. President, the minister responsible in this area has the ability in policy to deal with that, and also the applicants have the ability within the amended legislation to ask for confidentiality from the beginning. So with those two items about the actual amendment, as I said, I support it completely. But I would like to go on, since the Leader of Government, Senator Cummins, spoke to the overall framework of renewable energy that this is part of. And I would like to perhaps just make 3 comments in few words. First one is, and I've spoken to this previously, is the idea of foreign direct investment in our photovoltaic space or in our renewable energy space. We are blessed in Barbados to have an abundance of sunshine. We are blessed to have a constant breeze. Some days are calm, some days are windy, but generally we have the northeast trades. And we are blessed with having wave action in our sea. All of these are sources of renewable energy, and they are ours. They're part of, I've heard people say it's part of our patrimony. That's the right word. I'm not sure if I'm using it correctly. But the reality is that it is what nature has given us. And I believe that we should have some type of framework, as I've said before, that we do not simply end up replacing the foreign exchange that we used for importing fossil fuels and replacing that with dividends that go out to foreign entities who play in the foreign. Now, I say that within the framework that I am not anti-foreign direct investment. I just simply would like to know what the framework is. Barbados relies on foreign direct investment, and we are friendly to investors to come here, and that must remain. But it also must be true that there should be some limitation, and we don't have the capacity locally sometimes to move as quickly as some large corporations overseas. And I'm simply asking that as we do this, let us have some framework that says in some way how much must remain part of our natural environment. My second point, Mr. President, is I'd like to talk about, and I get into dangerous territory here, Mr. President, because this is, as the Senator, the Leader of Government Business has said, is a very technical area, and I am hesitant to go into this area. But I've recently understood that we are reaching some technical limitation on the photovoltaic production within our grid. And I understand this in layman's terms. Fundamentally, when the sun is shining during the day, and I've heard today that we are the second most densely PV implemented country in the world, which is great, But guess what? Sometime around 5:30 in the evening, maybe even as early as 4:30, that PV stops production and it doesn't restart until the next day at 8:30. And the other thing with the challenge that we have is that we're an island of 21 by 13. And quite often we get some rainy days. And when it's a rainy day in Barbados, it's probably a rainy day everywhere. And we've all been outside, at the beach when a cloud passes over, and you can feel the difference in the sunshine on your body. And if you look at PV generation, and I am privileged to have a small PV system at home, and I can track it on the internet, and when a cloud passes over, the PV generation drops immediately. And you could imagine the problem that our electrical generation system has, Mr. President, in dealing with this, because we can't predict this. So they have to be ready immediately to step in. And they do that today with spinning capacity because we don't have significant batteries. And that's what I want to talk about, is the batteries. And why is it today that we don't have the level of storage that we need? And I see a lot being written. I've seen some applications in the newspaper for large storage facilities. And, Mr. President, I would put forward that there are two reasons why we don't have that. One is a technology issue which we can't solve, which is that battery technology globally is somewhat in its infancy. Lead-acid batteries that we've seen in cars for years were great for that, but the lithium-ion and nickel metal hydride batteries that we see in these phones and so on is completely different. And when we're talking now about grid-level storage batteries, it's a completely different technology. What you need for these phones is you need to charge quickly, discharge quickly, be light and mobile. That's of no consequence at all to grid-level storage. It can be as big as you want it to be, and you want it to charge often and recharge and last for years. Most of these phones, as you all know in here, 2, 3, 4 years, they're gone. So the battery doesn't need to last too long. So one aspect of it is technology, but the other aspect of it is the structure of our feed-in tariff. Today, there is no difference in the price that is paid to a person generating electricity, whether that electricity is generated from the sun immediately or is stored and is released over time so as to help that grid level itself out. And that has been wrong from the beginning and needs to be fixed. My understanding is that that matter is, Mr. President, is before the FTC, and we will be getting some answer to it soon. And I look forward to that, because without recognition that the storage of electricity and later release to help with the grid is more valuable than the instantaneous generation, we will not have batteries, because no one will invest in a battery which is costing you twice as much as the original photovoltaic system if the electricity as drawn from the battery is going to be purchased at the same price as it's drawn from the PV. We need to fix that. And, Mr. President, this has been recognized by our monopoly, Light and Power, for years, because in their rate build-up, they tell us, listen, when you go to that switch and switch it, the light is on immediately, huh? You don't just have to pay us for the light that you get right away, or the electricity, but I'm using Barbados words, the light, because we pay light bills, right? We don't pay electricity bills. Yeah. It's funny, you know, Mr. President, because my daughter lives in Toronto, and she pays a hydro bill in Toronto. That's what they pay. They don't pay an electricity bill either. They pay a hydro bill because their electricity comes from hydro stations. So the Light and Power has recognized, and through our rates, that the fact that they have the capacity to deliver electricity as soon as we turn on the light, we must pay them to be ready. And similarly, that concept must come through with battery storage. You must pay us to be ready immediately for that. Mr. President, in concluding my few words, I want to speak on one other matter which I have touched on previously under this energy bill, and that is electric vehicles and how we are dealing with this goal of 2030 zero carbon. I want to just say to the Chamber today and ask you all to join with me in recognizing that a war on global warming, a war on our climate getting warmer and warmer, this war that our Prime Minister has led with tremendous skill and has gotten Barbados on the map as a leader in small island states in looking that we pay the consequence of carbon generated into the atmosphere by lots of other people. We must look at this carefully and recognize that this is a war on carbon. This is a war on carbon dioxide. This is not a war on internal combustion engines. Our policy that we seem to have is guiding us towards the saying that the solution is electric vehicles for transportation. We need to look at this very, very carefully. Less than 10% of the cars produced last year and sold were electric vehicles. If we as a country are going to attempt to compete against the wealthiest countries in the world to buy electric vehicles in right-hand drive and suitable for us, we have a problem. We have to recognize, and in another life, Mr. President, as I think you know, and some of my fellow senators, I spend a lot of time in motor racing. I spend a lot of time in motor racing at the highest level. And in Formula One, in 2025, they will be 100% carbon neutral emissions from their engines. 100%. That's the highest level of motorsport in the world. 2025, fully sustainable internal combustion engines. In Barbados, where we can live with very small capacity engines, we can use sustainable fuels, we can win the war on carbon with internal combustion engines being part of our solution. Of course, electric vehicles have a place. Of course, hybrids, electrification has a place. But let us not forget that our war is on carbon. It's on carbon dioxide. It's not on internal combustion engines. So, Mr. President, I think I have spoken to the amendments. I have said that I support them in full. I have said that I look forward to the ministry and all of those good people that the Senator referred to do this and to move ahead quickly, because we do need it. We need this system to handle. I've spoken about the foreign direct investment and the need to keep Barbadians involved in the sector. I've spoken about the feed-in tariff and the need for batteries and how we deal with that. And I've spoken about internal combustion engines. And with those few words, I'm obliged to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator Maladu. Senator Nurse.
Thank you, Mr. President. I promise to be as brief or even briefer than the previous speaker. I just want to make a few comments. First of all, that and to recognize that I understand the need for this amendment to the legislation. It seems to me, when you look at it, that obviously it helps to protect against, frivolous or objections which may come up against someone who has put in an application for a license. So we want, obviously, the system not to be bogged down with that kind of, those kind of situations, but also to recognize that there needed to be a framework in which such objections and so on must be brought. And to the extent that a little bit of tidying up has been done in this area, it is obviously a good thing. And but having said that, Mr. President, I am wondering if the board, and I am thinking of the board of ALPA, may not have been the better person to whom such objections should be made. In other words, it takes the burden, it would have taken the burden from the minister, let's say, for having to finally make the decision as to whether these objections are, if there's any validity in them. And obviously, it protects them against any it would protect them against any allegations of, politics or otherwise in the area. So I am just throwing, it's just a thought that it's come to me, and I'm throwing that out for what it's worth. But Mr. President, what I really wanted to speak more on, the two things which I caught my attention within recent times in the press. One was one of the leading merchants, one of the leading trading companies in Barbados. And permit me if I mention the name, it was the RLC group of companies. And I recall the president of the group, the chairman, of the group, Sir David, complaining of the fact of the length of time that it was taken to actually have his installations connected up to the system. Interestingly, what I found was that he wasn't blaming the government or the government machinery that was responsible for issuing the licenses, but he was blaming the Barbados Light and Power Company that had the responsibility for hooking up to the system. And then I believe it was last week or 2 weeks ago, but very, very recently, I saw the Light and Power had put a notice in the press, notifying that they had made application. I think it was for about 6 licenses at various locations, in all probably amounting to about, about 65 megawatts, I believe it was. I don't remember the total, but at each location, when you multiply it by the total, it would have been a significant amount. The point I'm making is that you have the Barbados Light and Power Company, which owns the transmission and distribution system, that owns the grid, who is also now going to be the biggest or one of the biggest generators of alternative energy on the system. And again, a thought came to me, well, what happens in a situation where they are also a generator, but they are also the owner of the system? Is there, and let me make the point very early that I'm not imputing any sort of bad intent or anything on the part of the Light and Power Company, but it is to say that I would think that under the circumstances, it may be very, very important to ensure that legislation or regulations would be considered, if it is not already, if the Ministry of Energy has not already done so, or whoever is the responsible authority, to ensure that independent, and when you say independent, those independent of the Barbados Light and Power Company that own the grid, that they are not disadvantaged because the Light and Power is tardy in putting them or connecting them up to the system. And that is important because when you have, particularly when you think about the big investors who are going to be prepared to put in significant investment. And once they commit to these investments and probably being financed by loan financing and so on, they need to be pretty certain that, within a reasonable period of time, once they have the system installed and so on, that it can be connected to the system and it can start to generate some income to be able to finance any loans and so on that they may have used for the investment. And so I would have thought, and I believe that when we think about it, some years ago when the telecommunication system was opened up, and the then cable and wireless of BT, as it would have been, would have lost the monopoly. I am pretty sure, I feel certain that there must have been some legislation within that Telecommunication Act to protect the other providers who would also be depending on cable and wireless to do the switching and whatever else has to be done. And so I'm thinking that in this case, in the case of the electric power system, that we need to have something similar in place to protect and to ensure that the other investors that are coming on and the other power generating investors that are coming on are not disadvantaged. And therefore, if a time frame is set up that, having gotten your license or having gotten your approvals and whatever else, that, a connection should be done within obviously what is a reasonable time frame by the powers that be. So again, I throw that out for what it is worth. Mr. President, those were the main 2 points that I wanted to raise. But I support the amendment and what is intended. I don't think that I think there's probably sufficient control within the legislation to ensure that it is not abused by anyone. And I would wish that as we move ahead, we would also recognize that we take the opportunity to look at the overall legislation, the overall act, and review it again. This legislation currently in place, I think, is 2013 legislation. We're 10 years now down from there. We have seen the rapid change, the rapid movement in terms of the alternative energies, systems, and so on. And so therefore, we have to question whether or not what the legislation currently in place is adequate to serve the situation now and in the next couple of years. We propose, as the proposal is, that we become fully, that we move towards fully non-fossil fuel energy usage by 2030. That is not a long time off. We are into 2023. So 7 years, and we know how the machinery of government, works. And so I would like to think that we take the opportunity now, as soon as possible, to start to review, if that is not in process just now, to review the entire act and to see how it will need to be brought up to scratch or up to date to be able to legislate or regulate the new types of systems that will be coming on and so on. I mean, you know, as we know, we're talking about, we've been talking much about PVs, production by the PV system, but obviously wind energy with all these other systems. Another big issue, storage, has to be attended to. So we have to be able to look at all of these things and make sure that we plan for them and that we have legislation which is adequate to see us through to 2030 and possibly beyond. And so with those few words, Mr. President, I am obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Nurse. Senator Dr. Bradford.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good afternoon to fellow senators. I too would like to express support for the amendment that has been proposed, which seemed to expand possibilities for consultation and dialogue and provides a mechanism for the approval of requests licensing for this particular sector. Mr. President, the emphasis of the government on renewable energy and moving our country to the 2030 goal of carbon neutrality and the environmental benefit that derive from that policy incorporates very noble goals. The whole project that has been proposed, where renewable energy and panels are used as an instrument of development, providing a cushion to assist in the financing of housing, that too represents, in my view, a noble venture. I would like to comment, Mr. President, on a point made by the Honourable Minister this morning with respect to the importance of research and development. And I wish to make the point in the context of new initiatives and new ventures that are not supported by research and development. New ventures and new initiatives that are not supported by research and development are usually liable to failure. That experience has been repeated several times in many places around the world. Research and development is vital to the sustainability of new initiatives such as these. And therefore, the minister's comment of the work that is being done in collaboration with the University of the West Indies, private sector agencies, the professional bodies in engineering is vital, very important. But I think in doing so, it is also important that we look at the possibility of exploring joint ventures with countries that are leaders in this field. This is important because the cost of this research and development is not cheap. It's expensive. And there are countries that are way ahead of us in this field who have done outstanding work in these initiatives. And we should be partnering using our diplomatic channels and our cooperation channels when we negotiate with these countries for collaboration. An important part of that collaboration can be research and development related to renewable energy. And I say that, Mr. President, because as we explore this new field, there are clearly important initiatives that are coming on stream. Let me just mention one that may be of interest. I recently read that in Kenya, solar energy is being used to drive desalination plants. In other words, the conversion of salt water to potable water using solar energy. This is a very important development. In fact, the report said that the plant that has been built is providing water for 25,000 persons in a hospital in a rural area in Kenya. Given the fact, Mr. President, that the cost of energy is a very important part of the desalination process and makes it expensive, this kind of new technology where solar energy is being used to convert seawater into fresh water is a significant development, and one that we in Barbados should be looking at, even in a pilot way, to see whether in fact it is economically feasible and whether it's something that we can explore. And I say that in the context of the need for research and development that can explore these new possibilities and bring to the table new initiatives that can in fact result in the sustainability of what we're doing. It's also an opportunity for training, opportunity for our young people to learn new ways of doing business and new things that are developing and happening around the world. Mr. President, while all of this is important and the actions taken by the government and the private sector in this area are vital, I think it is also important to see this new initiative in the context of the people and the fact that the average Barbadian must also participate actively in the whole concept of renewable energy, not only from the point of view of its use, but from the point of view of understanding how it should be used and the whole business of the conservation of energy. What do I mean by this? I mean that there must be public information and training and exposure of the average person to the conservation and the more efficient use of energy generally. Because at the end of the day, if we can use energy more efficiently, it reduces the costs of our survival and makes our living more sustainable. Let me give you a simple example. One simple example. LED lights have a lifespan of 120,000 hours. The ordinary lights that we use, incandescent lights, have a lifespan of 1,500 hours, the bulbs. So that the LED light is 80 times more efficient in providing the light needed than the ordinary bulbs that we use. The refrigerator, the clothes dryers, the electric kettles, the electric ovens. We need to be more conscious of the cost of energy and to use these appliances efficiently. What I'm asking, Mr. President, for is public information and public knowledge on energy that can make our renewable efforts even more sustainable if, in fact, we are more conscious of the use of energy in the home. I have one last question which arose some time ago and still remains a question for me. There was a report which I saw in one of the daily newspapers that the energy policy, which moves us to 2030, could result in a reduction in government income, tax income. And that reduction could have some impact on the availability of resources for the things that have to be done in our country. I don't know to what extent this has been researched, has been proven to be true, has been examined, or has been quantified. But in my capacity as a representative of the people, I would ask, is this true? And if it is so, what steps will be taken to fill the gap? Or what strategies would we implement in order to ensure that our policy is sustainable and can be maintained over the long term in the context of the demands on government income? Mr. President, I believe that what we are doing in the area of energy is commendable. It is important for the future of our country, and therefore, with those few words, I lend my support to the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Dr. Bradford. Senator Millard.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would normally speak in the afternoon, but I have to attend an event for one of my friends, Mr. President. A terminal event, Mr. President. Now, Mr. President, I was told by one of my friends that the Barbados Light and Power Company was established as a regulated public utility. And it's over 100 years old, and that it's supposed to serve the public good. Now, in the short time that I've been around, I've seen lots of changes. I never owned stock in Light and Power, could never afford it. But there were changes made, Mr. President, to that company that prevented ordinary people, all of us, from buying stock in Light and Power. And that happened, I think, between 2011 and 2014. But since that's happened, there's been major changes, Mr. President, in what's happened to the dividend share for those who've retained their stock. Their payments have become massive. And there's been constant complaint. I saw it reported in the press that the level of investment or reinvestment into infrastructure by the company has essentially been switched around, whereas you had 15% payment in dividends and about 85% in reinvestment in the company, it has gone 85% payment in dividends and 15% reinvestment. But that is obviously unsustainable. And when Senator Cummings spoke, I think it was Senator Cummings spoke about the potential for large amounts of foreign exchange being redirected out of Barbados when you have foreign direct investment. It was Senator Malo, I'm sorry. That, I would like to point out that that's already the case. I was given a sheet of paper that came from an official document that came from a recent hearing, and the numbers there were staggering. And when one looked at the level of payment to the company by its customers over a 10-year period, and the level of payment to the shareholders, it was clear that there's probably no hope. And I say that on purpose, Mr. President. Now, when a customer pays their light bill, 60% of it goes to the BNOC. And the light and power is merely like, I suppose, sure pay in collecting the BNOC's money. And people often think that they pay all the money to the light and power, but it's not so. The fuel charges go to the BNOC. The BNOC controls all the fuel imports. That is probably a good thing. And government should never give up that right. Now, $6.3 billion was paid to the light and power since 2010. Now, not 6.3 billion, 3.75 billion was paid in fuel charges. The remainder was paid to the light and power. So the net income of light and power is an estimated 635 million in that time period. Mr. President, I know you are a highly, highly qualified accountant, so those numbers will stick in your mind and you'll tell if they're wrong or right. But unbelievably, 538 million was paid out in dividends. 538 million of 635 million. Mr. President, if any company can do that, and it is sustainable, then it's a miracle. Now, there are very, very few companies that you can start, or very few businesses you can start, Mr. President. And from day one, you can have a maximum income generation. Now, probably the only one is when you put on PVs and the sun is shining, and you turn them on, and you happen to be fortunate enough to be hooked up, you can start earning a maximum rate. There's probably nothing else you can do. If you sell bread, you have to get customers. If you sell certain things like chicken, even then, you have to build a business and get more branches. But with PVs, when you turn it on, 100% generation capacity once the sun is shining. It was obvious, Mr. President, that with time, we could not maintain grid stability if everybody, without a plan, and have not yet heard or seen a document that has said what the plan is. Without a plan about how we're going to maintain grid stability. While the sun is shining and everybody's producing, it was obvious you reach a point where the production during the day might exceed your needs, and at night, when the sun is not shining, you depend on generation. Now, battery storage on a commercial basis, Mr. President, was inevitable. I recently saw an ad in the paper, an article in the paper, Mr. President, that said it was a very interesting ad placement. It said, Biden signs Respect for Marriage Act. I said, let me read this. But it wasn't that, Mr. President. There were 6 public notices placed in the paper for 6 10-megawatt storage facilities in Barbados. I think they were in St. Michael, St. Philip, and St. Thomas. And I lamented, Mr. President. I thought that the Hope Project, Mr. President, was a fantastic way of bringing in community PV. But I thought that that ad and another ad that I saw, which spoke about the need to stop connections until the issue of battery storage is resolved, put a dark shadow on the Hope Project. And I heard an Now, Mr. President, unless the Hope Project is hooked up already, and every individual house is routed separately in the details, if everyone goes in separately, then maybe they will escape. But to my mind, it worried me. Now, Mr. President, the matter of storage of electricity is an interesting one. When the BLMP implements its storage plan, we will pay. We will pay with a rate increase. When the individual producer is required to implement a storage plan, I do not believe there will be an increase in their rate. So you'll be producing power and getting paid the same rate with a greater investment. So if you have a license, like I know someone who happens to have a couple small licenses. My colleague on the right has one. And Mr. President, if they're not connected up so far, they will probably have to have battery storage. But that's further capital investment, Mr. President. But you won't be paid for it. Now, Senator Bradford mentioned water. And yes, there is the suggestion that if you have photovoltaic generation at the desalination plants and the water augmentation project, that it will somehow affect the cost of the water. It does not in this country. It makes no difference, zero, to your cost per cubic meter. And remarkably, the water augmentation project has no storage. They produce water and pump it off someplace to a government-owned reservoir. They don't have to store it now, but they have a massive photovoltaic plant. But that hasn't affected the negotiated price per meter. I am pretty certain that the desal plant has to the north of it a ground-mounted photovoltaic plant. Maybe the Minister of Energy can tell us if that energy is used to bring down the price of water. I suspect that it isn't. I suspect that it only reflects in the profit line of all these accounts, Mr. President. So while we speak of green energy and alternative energy as a source of reducing costs, it is only relevant if you have to purchase the product from a third party, if it is negotiated in the original contract. So the citizens of this country will not benefit from having a reduced cost of water per cubic meter if these things are not done, Mr. President. Now, I wanted to mention something that Senator Cummings said. She said, and I hope I'm not misquoting her, that the Barbados Light and Power Company was like a politician. Correct. You're absolutely right. Absolutely right. In context, you do not keep your promises.
Mr. President, a point of order. The Honourable Senator is leading the House.
Mr. President, in 2010, I was hearing, Mr. President, Mr. President,
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I'm raising a point of order. The Honourable Senator is misleading the House. The politicians, I don't know what politicians the Honourable Senator is speaking, but I believe we campaign on promises, on a mantra, promises made, promises kept. We actually have an entire manifesto, Mr. President, that outlines promises made and promises kept.
You would not have read it, that's the problem.
Mr. President, I did read the manifesto. And Mr. President, in 2010, at a hearing, the BL&P committed to make improvements in the generation system, and they did not keep the promise. That's the eye for which I viewed it, Mr. President.
For clarity, in the context of, as you had made reference to politicians, you're saying the Barbados Light and Power Company is...
It's not the party, not the party. The Barbados Light and Power Company.
Okay, in 2010. Okay. Just to clarity of the record. Thank you very much.
So that, well, Mr. President.
Yes.
So, and with regard to the breaker example that Senator Cummings also made, Mr. President, there has to be a plan, Mr. President. If you randomly assemble something and you don't plan it, your breaker is going to trip every time. And I have not seen the plan, Mr. President. We seem, and if there's someone can point me to it, I'll be happy to see it all night and read it, or all day and all week. We have a long holidays coming up. There has to be a sequential plan for energy. And when we are transitioning from fossil fuel to green energy, Mr. President, we knew that there would come a point when those who put systems onto the grid would reach the point where it would be in excess of what could be handled and it had to be stored. It happened every other place. And what we have to hope, Mr. President, that some of the catastrophes that have happened in other places does not happen here. Now, there's a young man, well, not so young anymore. Some years ago, Mr. President, we built a house. And the young electrician who had a young company insisted that he would not do the work before the electrical plan. And you had to sit and say, well, are you going to have a dishwasher? Or if you were going to have one, you had to include it. All the things that would take power. Do you want a dryer? Is it going to be gas-fired, or is it going to be electrically run? Washing machine, toaster, everything that drew power. And then he said, well, this is the breaker panel that you need. And these are the breakers that you need. So you can turn on all of them and run them at the same time, and you will not trip because there was a plan. If you do not have a plan, and you cannot plan for everything, Mr. President, lots of breakers will trip and people will be surprised. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Leonard. Other speakers? Senator Drakes.
Mr. President, thank you very much for recognizing me. And I want to make a few observations, given the discussion that we've already had as it relates to this Electric Light and Power Amendment 2022. And I'll start in relation to one of the comments, and I think that it is the foundation of the conversation, where the leader of government business mentioned that this is a complex issue by no stretch of the imagination. We have come to this chamber and we've made about 2 or 3, this may be the 4th amendment now, to accommodate the changes that are happening in the sector. And that should already give an indication of how quickly things are changing and the demands that are happening in the sector. But sir, there's some other things I wanted to talk about. I'll say something short before lunch. We have a goal. That is to be, first, it was fossil fuel free by 2030, based on the engineering and the infrastructure that's available. Even globally, a lot of persons have abandoned that, more or less, and now persons are talking about net zero or being carbon neutral by 2030. And I suspect that switch in the target was based on the practicalities and the physical changes that would have to happen across the board. So we have a target, we have a goal. What we're facing now as we move along, despite having the Barbados National Energy Policy, are design issues. If you take a bird's eye view of all of this, it is multiple components, multiple and diverse players coming into a space by which historically was not there. It just did not exist. The complexity did not exist. You had a utility that generated electricity, it distributed, transmitted, it did everything. You now have multiple players with various types of energy trying to come onto an energy grid that, by and large, was not meant for this type of complexity. Mr. President, what we have to consider then is the design of the infrastructure and the engineering behind it is one part. There is the economic design, which is another part. We've already introduced independent power producers. Senator Maynard alluded to it just now. Are we ensuring that those persons who enter that market space are getting a fair rate of return in relation to the utility? You also have the economic or the market considerations when you're talking about the monopoly or the utility company owning the grid, and what type of services will they have to provide in terms of pivoting their business, no longer being the sole generator, and what is a fair distribution in terms of the market share, and what profits are feasible in that context, now that you've moved them now from one type of player into the market into having to share the market with other players, Mr. President. And then you have your regulatory design, because form follows function. We know that. So depending on where we want to take the industry, then all other things flow. And I think that is where we are. And it's not a criticism, it's just a practicality, it's just the reality of the situation across the world, where people are trying to figure out how to get this done, given the ecological crisis that we face. In relation to Barbados, it's also in terms of economic independence, energy independence, removing ourselves from having to rely on fossil fuel imports, Mr. President. So I think the bird's eye view has to happen in relation to the design of the energy sector. When we think about things, for instance, also like large producers versus homeowners being onto the grid, how are those things being facilitated? We recently had the homeowners' right to renewable energy policy, which tried to reserve some of the capacity on the grid for homeowners. All of these things, as we go along, we're trying to integrate into the policy, into the sector, and it will be difficult. And as was stated, there are competing interests across stakeholders. So I think coming off of Senator Maynard's contribution, in terms of a plan, it's not just a plan, but it is the design of the energy sector. Mr. President, I also want to say there may also come a time where there are new technologies that come on board that will allow persons to buy and sell to each other. What does that possibly look like, and how does that either complement or conflict with the existing infrastructure that we have at the moment? So for me, Mr. President, I wanted to make this intervention in terms of how we speak about it from a technical perspective in relation to engineering and design, from the economic and the market structure, and then also from the regulatory framework. I think those things have to go together, and what we're facing at the moment is we've embarked on a very ambitious goal. However, we are now trying to put the components together that they all function in a way that everyone has an equitable state. Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Drake. Speakers? Senator, Reverend Dr. Rogers.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I will be very brief. Like the other senators who have spoken before, I fully support this amendment, and I believe it is timely. I particularly like the portion of Section 5A, second paragraph, which deals with what is required of interested parties. And I'm highlighting this because one of the things I'm very conscious about is that we do not have much time to play around with this. We need to be very serious about where we're going with this matter. We need to be very serious about the future of our country where energy is concerned. Because one person once said, energy independence is a key driver of economic and national development. And if we are going to truly see ourselves moving into the 21st century as a progressive nation, energy has to be at the forefront of our concerns. We just saw the World Cup, the conclusion of the Football World Cup in Qatar. And we looked at the lovely facilities there. I was somewhere else and someone had passed through Qatar and passed through the airport there, and they said the airport is a city. It's actually a city. It's one of the most beautiful things you can possibly see. But Qatar's wealth comes from its energy. It's the largest exporter of natural gas in the world. We're told that the royal family has sovereign wealth of over 335 billion. They own large portions of the United Kingdom. They have interest in the Empire State Building. That's what happens when you invest in energy. And I believe that Barbados has a prime opportunity. You may ask, why say Barbados? Because Barbados, as Senator Cummins pointed out when she led off this bill here, at one point was the leader in the use of solar energy in this region. And I will say a little more about that as I go along. But I'm particularly interested in Section 5A, where it deals with interested parties, because I do not want it to be a case, and I think Senator Cummins spoke to this, where persons can frustrate a process. I think that what is set out here is good enough to ensure that only serious inquiries can be made. But let us remember that in spite of that, Barbados has a problem in the speed of doing business in this world. We're 128th out of 190 countries in this world in terms of the speed of doing business, and that is something we definitely have to work on too if we're going to develop this energy sector. But while I would encourage foreign investment, like Senator Malalu, I also believe that we need to invest in ourselves. We need to trust ourselves. It was C.L.R. James who once said, nobody knows what the Caribbean man is capable of because nobody ever asked. this situation is asking us what we're capable of. And I hear from time to time, as one who listens to the radio, I don't know much about wealth and so on, I've never been close to it. But I understand that there's a lot of money in the banks in Barbados, that people have a lot of money saved. And the question is, how much do we trust ourselves? How much do we trust ourselves? We've seen over the years, many of our great local companies were just picked off. I can still see Ras Eili on the stage at the National Stadium clutching one of the monitors and saying, "We do not own our bank anymore." But the reality is that the opportunities were there. I can remember the former Prime Minister, the late Owen Arthur, begging Barbadians, begging to invest in their bank, and challenging us that if we're going to truly be serious about an energy sector in this country, as Senator Drakes pointed out, we have to look at the broader picture. We have to look at our infrastructure, we have to look at everything, but we have to trust ourselves. We have to trust ourselves to believe we are capable of doing this, because the benefits may not be for us. The benefits may not be for this generation, but they're for generations to come. You know, one person, when he sends out his emails, usually says, has a little caption at the bottom, "Take no thought of reaping, only sowing." We're sowing the seed now. We must make the sacrifices now for generations to come. I was pleased to hear in Senator Cummins' speech, she said that the aim would be to make Barbados the knowledge capital in terms of research and development. And she also made mention of the principal of the University of the West Indies agreeing with this whole notion. I'm happy to hear that. But you know the reality? Barbados had the opportunity to be the center of knowledge and the knowledge capital in this region and indeed this world decades ago. And I'm talking about through the work of the great Professor Oliver Headley, at whose feet I was able to sit in the University of the West Indies when I was there. Professor Headley gave a speech in 1997, which was entitled, "The Sun Will Still Shine When the Oil Runs Out." The sun will still shine when the oil runs out. That was 25 years ago. A whole generation ago. And it was not just a speech. It was not just his speeches. As the then governor of the central bank, Dr. Marion Williams, pointed out on the occasion of his death, she said he displayed throughout his entire career the qualities which the region needs in order to be more at the cutting edge of scientific inquiry. That was in 2002 when he died, over 20 years ago. The National Institute of Higher Education, Research, Science, and Technology had this to say. In the 1960s, he pioneered solar energy for heating purposes and crop drying. It's the 1960s. He also designed the first and largest electrical grid system using solar energy, which is installed at Harrison's Cave. This is someone from here, in Barbados. They went on to say Headley's innovations on photovoltaic cells of solar still designing were used throughout the Caribbean and Central America. His solar cells were used to generate electricity to computers, laboratories, buildings, and ice makers on fishing boats. He built numerous solar dryers for timber, sugarcane, and other produce in Grenada, Guatemala, Belize, and El Salvador. That's someone from Barbados who taught in our university. I can remember being at university and he had the things out on the lawn, his little experiments there. But you know the problem? He couldn't get any funding. No one was interested. At one point, giving a speech in Jamaica, Professor Headley told the audience, Jamaica receives 77 trillion watt-hours a day, courtesy of the sun. That is equivalent to 47.6 million barrels of oil per day. He said plants only use less than 1%, so you're throwing away 46 million barrels of oil per day. There's somebody who died in the year 2002. Lorraine James, writing about Professor Headley, says, Headley's push for solar energy was driven by two factors. One, the threat to the planet if alternatives to fossil fuels were not found. And two, the real possibility that rising sea levels will in time flood Barbados, Trinidad, and the coast of Guyana and Florida. So long before our Prime Minister was on the world stage talking about global warming and the threats of climate change, Professor Headley saw it. As I said, at that time, on the lawn of university, you'll see all these things. He was working on solar ovens, solar all kinds of things. He had no funding. And part of the problem he had, he said, you know, the reality is that to set up a solar panel right now is at $4 per watt, $4 per watt. He died in 2002. Do you know that's the cost today? It's between $3 to $5 US per watt for solar energy. Professor Headley, as I said, was a pioneer and a Barbadian. At the time, many did not have the vision that he had. We did not see the broader picture. But I'm sure that somewhere in the halls of the University of the West Indies, there are papers that have been written by Professor Headley. I've said that to say we do not have to reinvent the wheel. We were in front. We were at the cutting edge long before many persons even thought about solar energy. All it requires is that we get back there. We pull up what Professor Headley would have been working on, because clearly he was way ahead of his time. And that's what happens usually. And I would like to see, though it has nothing to do with this debate, at some point in time, he's honored posthumously for his genius. For his genius as a pioneer in the very things that we are now discussing and now thinking about. And so, the question lies before us, the same thing that CLR James would have raised. No one knows what we're capable of, because no one ever asked. This current situation is asking. And I would like to see one day Barbados becomes the Qatar of this region and this world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Reverend Dr. Rogers. Senator Dr. Hines.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good afternoon. I feel a little odd in present company because my view on the legislation is a little bit divergent. And I say this to speak specifically about the content of the legislation, not so much to speak about the broader context of renewable energy, but the legislation itself. And I noted when this legislation initially came to public attention, there was quite a bit of discussion about it. If we go on the website of the Parliament of Barbados, you're actually able to see some public comments and concerns being raised about the legislation on the very same issue that Senator Cummins raised, which is a matter of consultation and the ability of persons to actually respond to license applications. So before I get into that, I just want to maybe lay my breadcrumbs, right? Like Hansel and Gretel, so we don't get lost along the way. So if I look back to the Electric Light and Power Act 2021-13, at 5.4, what I note, and Senator Cummins went through some of this, is that an applicant will not have the ability to be issued a license until a period of 3 months from the date of first publication has elapsed, right? So they have to give notice, it's a 3-month period. And there is an opportunity at 5.4B then, there is an opportunity given to all ALL interested parties during the period specified in paragraph A, that is at 3 months, to make representations or objections. So not necessarily a representation, does not have to be an objection. It says representation or objections, right? So that means that we're not necessarily talking about persons making themselves nuisances, which I think sometimes is the implication here. You have a concerned citizen, and they may be making a representation, not to say that they object to something, but there may be something about the manner in which this is occurring that they have a concern about, and they would like revisited, clarified, or something of the sort. Okay, still laying the breadcrumbs. So this opportunity is given to all interested parties during the period specified to make representations or objections to the minister in relation to the application. I summarized it a bit because I just don't want to read over all that stuff again. But this is the general sense of what we have at 5.4. The amendment moves us from a specified period of 3 months, to we have an opportunity given to interested parties, not all. All is taken out, so obviously that's not an important word because it was removed. Or maybe it was an important word and therefore was removed, but not all interested parties, but given to interested parties. And we have at 5A, the parameters for interested parties to make their representations or objections. So this is in the current amendment I'm speaking about now. Within 28 days. 28 days of this first publication. 28 days being less than 3 months. So I can understand certainly that we want things to move at pace, right? We want for licenses to be considered swiftly. We do not want to frustrate those who are making applications. This makes perfect sense. However, we need to consider, in my opinion, that those who submitted the license applications, the applicants, probably had the time to sit down and craft the application. And a concerned citizen, or perhaps another corporate entity that may also want to make a representation or may have an objection, may require more than 28 days to do this appropriately. How can I come up with this? Why isn't 28 days enough? Maybe if you're a corporate entity and you have a dedicated team that can sit down and do this, 28 days could be fine. But if you are a concerned citizen, Mr. President, who has to go to work and deal with whatever you have to deal with in your life, your parents, perhaps children, your dog, volunteer work, whatever it is people do, exercise, 28 days is not a lot of time to dedicate to this. So what is the balance that we are striking here between the public interest in the utility and expediting an application process? So yes, consultation is allowed here, but the period for consultation is quite short compared to what existed, or exists, I should say, in the legislation as it currently stands. This notion that this amendment is introducing the ability for consultation, that does not appear to be true. I say it does not appear to be true because I just noted that consultation is already allowed within a 3-month period. It is already allowed. What we do not have, it is allowed, right? In the current legislation. What we do not have in the legislation as it stands right now are the specific procedures. So about numbered paragraphs, okay? It must be submitted in writing in numbered paragraphs and that kind of thing. And within a 28-day period. But the provision for consultation already exists. And
Mr. President, I want a point of order.
Sure.
Comments.
Mr. President, the Honourable Senator is misleading the House, and I would wish to make it clear that what was said is that the mechanism for under which consultation takes place is what is being outlined. The parameters for consultation are being elaborated on, but that there was no pre-existing mechanism that allowed what was already listing in the legislation to have applicability into what the consultation looked like. The Honourable Senator, however, has impugned and suggested that I have said that there was no consultation mechanism in the legislation before, and I would wish to make it clear that we have said there was no mechanism outlining the parameters by which the consultation would take place, and I outlined those as listed in paragraph 5A and its respective subsections.
Thank you, Senator Cummings. Senator Dr. Hines.
Okay, thank you. Yes, that's true, you did say that. I also noted that, it's true, that was said. And what was also said is that anyone who would object to the inclusion of consultation is seeking to obfuscate. So, I mean, there's...
Mr. President, on a point of order.
Yes, Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, the Honourable Senator is misleading the House. I did not say that anyone who attempts to consult is attempting to obfuscate. I used the word obfuscate specifically to define what was meant in terms of an interested party. And if I, for example, was looking at a rooftop in a parish, 2 parishes out, and I chose to say I have an objection and I would wish to object, that may be an attempt to obfuscate the process, but it had nothing to do with what would be defined in the amendment to the legislation as an interested party. I would wish to have the Honourable Senator not attempt to twist my words, whether deliberately or otherwise.
May I continue, Mr. President?
Continue, Senator Dr. Hines.
Thank you. As I was indicating, the provision for consultation currently exists, and it will continue to exist. If and when, I will say when, because everybody agrees, we have this new legislation, but what we will have is consultation in a more circumscribed way, because the period for the consultation for the representations or objections has been reduced. And as previously noted, it is not simple for a concerned citizen within a 28-day period to make such a representation, but if this is the will of the government of Barbados, so be it. We have a process that expedites, and this can be useful. It can be useful for business purposes, for the particular objectives of the government. And this is good. People want to get their stuff done quickly. However, I think we also have to consider the fact that this is a democracy. And within a democracy, there are also other considerations that one needs to balance. It is a democracy, I believe, so that should not be contentious in the slightest. However, in thinking about this balance, sometimes things may need to move a little bit slowly in order to give people, you know, ordinary people. Mr. President, I would just like to know if I can continue. Right.
Presenter, please continue.
Thank you.
Address the chair.
So what I am saying here is that people should not be viewed as nuisances, should not be viewed as holding up, this is my word that I'm using, should not be viewed as holding up a process because they require a little bit more time in order to review something that may affect them. The utility, electricity, something that all of us use. VAT-free data is today. People are going in town, in this bridge town and other places, up and down buying television, cell phone, washing machines, all kind of things that they're gonna go home and plug in, right? They are all concerned citizens and they all have an interest in the electricity in this sector. So any of them is an interested party. And there should not be any reason that any person who is an interested party and sees something and says, I want to make a representation about this, but I need some time to understand it, should be barred by a 28-day period. But as I said, if this is the will of the government, it shall be done. My one can't stop it from happening. However, I am going to raise the point here because I think it is an important one to consider, that everything is not just about the efficiency of doing business. This is important, but other things are also important because this is a small place. This is not that we are talking about something is happening in the electricity sector in Nevada and somebody in Manhattan wants to make a representation about what's happening in Nevada. We live in a country where a monkey can shut down electricity for an entire country in one place. A little country where one monkey can shut down the whole grid. So if I live in St. Lucie and something is happening in Christchurch, I am not a nuisance if I want to make a representation. And I'm not, no, because the grid, it's small. There's a little place. I'm not a nuisance if I have a concern and I want to make a representation. So I want to put that on the table, Mr. President. But I also want to put something else on the table because I do think there are improvements in this legislation. And the specific improvement I see in this legislation is that the minister's discretion is not the only thing that is bearing on these representations and objections. And this was my concern with the legislation as it currently stands. Because as it currently stands, it is the minister. It is all in the hands of the minister. This amendment has the minister in consultation with the committee. So the committee is able to look at representations or objections and advise the minister. And I believe this is an improvement because the 2013 legislation, which establishes the committee, does not really explain how the committee is supposed to fulfill its function. So there is a lot of discretion in the hands of the minister, which I do not think, again, is necessarily the best thing to have in a democracy. So we have, with regard to these representations or objections, the inclusion now, which is different from the previous legislation, and this to me is the improvement, the addition of the committee that will advise the minister. What I also like is that there are set timeframes, but these set timeframes, when we add up the time, they lead us to 2.5 months, as opposed to the 3 months that we had previously. There is also, and this also pertains to these requests for confidentiality. So this is not just at the discretion of the minister. So it would be more difficult for someone to say, the minister is allowing X entity to have this kept confidential because that's a person's friend, because it's their cousin, because they have some other connection. Because now you have a committee that is advising. So this to me is an improvement. Mr. President, before I close, there's something else I wanted to add here. So in addition to my concerns about the potential for this legislation to provide some closure as opposed to keeping the level of openness for representations and objections from the public, the people of Barbados. I also have a niggling concern about the new Electric Supply Act that I have been hearing about. The Barbados Chamber of Commerce and Industry had a renewable energy forum and expo, and at this expo in October 2022, I'll wait for the music. Amazing. Right. So, Mr. President, so we heard of the Electric Supply Act. It's getting louder. The Electric Supply Act. I note on October 18, 2022, that the then minister indicated to the public at said forum, it actually would have been well, this is noted on the GIS, Government Information Service, I believe the terminology is, that this act is now in its final stages, right? This is the previous Minister of Energy. And my question is about the connection between these two things. This is the reason I have a question, as I have not seen the act. So, my question about these two things is for the following reason. As we think about the future of how we are supplying electricity in this country, we know that we are going to be seeing something that is quite different from what we currently experience. I heard several senators in here today already speak about this. We are going to be providing energy in a new way. And considering this, it is quite a good idea to have new legislation governing this new framework. My question, therefore, is, why not just put everything in the new legislation? Why are we going through, this amendment does not deal with the supply of electricity. It does not deal with how electricity is being generated. It is dealing with the licensing process, and it is really dealing with representations and objections being made during the licensing process, and what those persons who make representations or object can or cannot see. They cannot see things that are confidential if the minister, after consulting with the committee, agrees that there are certain things that should remain confidential. That is all this amendment does. And if this is such a small thing in a way, could it not wait? So this is more about us, as Senator Drake said, coming here over and over to amend a piece of legislation. When we are coming up with a new framework, why not incorporate the critical things in the new framework? And I know some people don't want me to ask the question because you ain't supposed to ask no questions, right? You're just supposed to sit down and say, oh yes, let's wait and see the legislation. And then when the legislation comes, go back in time and say, but how come this other thing wasn't put in there? But I'm asking the question now because the legislation has not come. That is the reason. So that when it comes, I hope, as I have no role in it, we will see it at the point when it has been drafted, when it has been completed, it's gone through all the processes, and it comes in here, and we ask for an amendment, and when people raise their hand and ask about an amendment, you do not get one. So therefore, I'm raising it at this point before it has come here. I do not know that it will go to a joint select committee for something as critical as the entire energy sector. So I'm raising it at this point as I have the opportunity so to do, in the hope that we will have a more holistic piece of legislation instead of dealing with a lot of pieces here, there, and everywhere. And as it stands, I do have to say, it is quite difficult to assess some of the legislation because it is not even compiled correctly right now. How is one finding this Electric Light and Power Act? How are you finding it? Where is it available? It is available. We have access to the legislation, but it does not contain all of the amendments. So this is my hope, Mr. President, and I thank you for allowing me, despite many rumblings from the floor, to speak.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Senator Dr. Haynes. The chair did not hear any rumblings. You were heard. There was nothing to disrupt your speech from what I could recognize. Only Maisie passing the music passing the street. Any further speakers? Senator Nichols.
Mr. President, I